talk to us about co-creation.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and good morning to those of you who logged in from other parts of the globe. Thank you, Rajesh, and everybody at Socratus. I'm excited to be here because co-creation is something that I learned by walking the steep incline, but it's completely been worth it. I also wanted to say that co-creation is not something which is just for those who are creating, but for anybody and everybody who has a heartbeat and wants to do something which is going to create change. And so today, what I'm going to do is I will begin with a short clip from a project that I just completed. It's a mobile based interactive documentary. And I wanted to sort of show you who my co creators were. And then I'll talk you through some aspects which I think are important in order to be able to use or implement co creation as a practical kit, as a design process. And then, of course, we'll have the breakout sessions and we'll come back and talk to each other about what we've learned and how we want to take this forward. So, without further ado, I'll start sharing my screen and introduce you to Deepa and her daughters, who were one of the co creators with me in this project called Ashiyan.
फिर वो लोग कह रहे जो देखो जब थोड़ी टाइम अंधेरा हो जाएगी ना 7-8 बज जाएगी तो तुम्हारा हड्डी भी नहीं मिलेगी मैं ऐसे एरिया में आ गए तब तो हम तीनों माँ बेटी लोग और कहाँ पे दिल्ली में कौन सी जगह में आ रही है ये पता नहीं जो हरिनगर में आ रही हूँ वो नोएडा जा रही हूँ ये भी पता नहीं थे कौन सी जगह में लेके जा रही बस दिल्ली में जाना था इतना ही पता नहीं ये लोग सोच रहे हैं दिल्ली में काम कर ली बहुत पैसे हैं इनके पास
तो मतलब सब कुछ की प्रॉब्लम होता है कपड़े खाना पीना सब कुछ बीमार किराए देना खाना पीना ये लोग कैसे चलाते लेडीज होके ये नहीं सोचता मेरी मम्मी की सर फट गई और मेरे मौसा कह रहे मोबाइल पे पैसे डाल दे तेरे फोन करती मेरे लोग फोन रखा दोबारा फोन मत करना
मेरे को वही डर लगते है जो तुम लोग इतना पढ़े लिखी नहीं हो जो दिल्ली में जहाँ मर्जी जाओ तो ये जैसे हम लोग बंगाल में तो क्या इंग्लिश लगती है बेटर तो ये है ना बोल नहीं पाते
इसमें इंग्लिश ने मेरी मम्मी को दुखी करके रखा
पहले जब मेरे शादी नहीं होता उस टाइम तो मैं थोड़ा हिंदी भी पढ़ ले तो शादी होके सब कुछ
बोलते इंग्लिश में हर जगह पे लिखा करो जैसे लिखते हैं कि राइटिंग सही नहीं है लेकिन लिख लेते हैं सरदार कैसे लिखते हैं पहले बंगाली में लिख दो नहीं तो
So that, ladies and gentlemen, was Deepa, and along with her are her daughters. And essentially what I wanted to do with the co-creation project that I referred to, titled Ashiyan, was to look at how is it that women, who I call the invisible women of Delhi, domestic workers and homemakers, how do they live in a city and negotiate mobility, especially when it is labeled the rape capital of the world. And the enterprise behind the project was to try and see that how do women who are perpetually tagged as victims become participants and citizens in a city? And I know that your previous session was about mobility and it looked at reorganizing city spaces physically. But I also think we need a lot of emotional and mental cartography to undergo changes as well. And that's why if we continue to refer to women as victims, and sort of label cities and accept labels such as rape capitals, we are not only robbing them of the space to be able to say that they disagree, but we're also not looking at all of these anecdotal moments, which are so critical, I think, not only to inform policy, but also to sort of equip each of us with strategies of survival. And because homemakers and domestic workers provide emotional labor, invisible labor that keeps cities afloat, they don't really make it to conversations or agenda pieces. So my aim was to see how, as a filmmaker, I could co-create reflective moments, which meant that I would have to share and make accessible my means of filming. And fortunately for me, mobile phone filmmaking has now become almost commonplace. So it was easier for me to devise a technological platform or bridge between us. But at the same time, it was a lot of reorganization, class, caste locatedness, literacies of various kinds, old orders, and resistance to new forms of learning. Each of these played up in the project. But what mattered was that each of us was trying to rethink what the city of Delhi could mean for us. And to be able to do that, we needed to become a micro community of our own. And each of these was possible only through co creation. But this is only one end of the co creation spectrum that I had the privilege of participating in. I'll now start sharing my slides with you and tell you a little bit about what the other end was. So I'll just share my screen again. So if you were to look at this slide, on one end, I have yet another domestic worker, Manorma, and her daughter. And on the other end, I have people who are very busy with laptops. Clearly, they're from different races and different genders. These are my collaborators from the Code for Boston community in the United States. They not only helped me develop and program the app, which domestic workers could use, but together we were able to reflect on a variety of capacities, which is to say, who are we creating this for? Will they be able to use it? So even though we take certain gestures for granted, such as pinches and swipes, there were lots of gestures with domestic workers who had created all this video footage and who were intended to be participants, co-creators, as well as interlocutors of the entire project, were not comfortable with. They could only tap. At best, they could swipe a little because their hands were used to other kinds of labor. So we decided to create something which was low in terms of literacy demands, but also gesturally was something that could acknowledge their limitations, not as limitations, but as possible ways in which to interact with the material. So at the end of the entire process, where I worked with domestic workers and homemakers, had them look at their mobile phones, and also worked with the accidental learning model, wherein I said, here are the phones, please play with them, please fiddle with them. Let's not look at filmmaking. Let's see how to use a phone, how to receive a call. I made sure the phones had torches so that they were familiar with the device. And once we had familiarity, we had various forms of experimentation, and the project continued. So my learning of co-creation really comes from not looking at capacities from a fixed lens. It's not me as a filmmaker and people who have equal or comparable technical capacities, but it's looking at people from another domain, such as developers, UI, UX experts, and domestic workers and homemakers who are experts at labor, emotional, invisible labor, and then trying to connect all of these to comment on the city, which is the capital of the world's largest democracy. And these people who are very much a part of the fabric, but are not really acknowledged, then become not just narrators, but also owners of the material. So therefore, today, I feel I can speak a little bit about co-creation with people, thanks to all of these people who were part of the journey with me. So I think one of the most important parts about co-creation, if that is a model you want to investigate and adopt, is to identify who your stakeholders are and to be most generous in deciding that almost anybody and everybody who is related to the project or the problem that you're trying to solve has an opinion that matters. Only then can you move ahead. And it's not easy, because I think co-creation, on the other hand, is also like a kind of recentering of who can be the sun in your universe. At the same time, I also learned in the project that you cannot be romanticizing participatory culture, because it has many, many, many hurdles that you need to mediate. You need to be able to come to a conclusion and speak the same vocabulary, which would mean patiently waiting for people to be able to be upskilled or to be able to come down to your level. Because, you know, if we were to really look at the larger perspective, our abilities are differential and they only change with time. In any other project, you would choose people who have similar, comparable, or compensatory skills and would work with them. That's a polyphonic style of working. But a co-creative style says, I will be patient. And therefore, the goal, as well as sometimes even the timelines that you have to achieve the goal, constantly change. And so it's not just a question of sharing the cookies and saying, here is a freshly baked batch of cookies. And I thought, given that, it's December, it's the perfect season to have this as the metaphor. It's about sharing the cookie dough. It's about saying, okay, when I'm making the basic ingredients, your hands will be in the dough as well. And to say that now we begin to decide what shape, what size, what flavor. And philosophically, if I were to want to romanticize the entire struggle that comes with co-creation, I would say it's like a lover's readiness to be plastically molded. You have to be so willing to be able to listen to even criticism and to listen to it with a patient and accepting ear that I think co-creation really is a rites of passage as well. So if I were to say, how would I define co-creation? I would say that it is an iterative experimental design process. That's particularly important because it not only talks about a cycle of feedback, but it also talks about a large cycle of self-reflexivity, where you yourself decide whether or not you have been able to achieve inclusion. Informed consent, I think, is critical. And this informed consent is not just, in the classical sense of how filmmakers go to people and say, this is how I'm filming you and this is where the footage will be used, but consent in terms of what is the value of the participation? Why should I share my time and resources with you? And what is our shared goal or our individual goals, which will be, part of that whole sum, which is greater than all of us. So I think that becomes very important. And human experience becomes, I think, central, and data comes a little later. And this can be uncomfortable for many because we are in a big data economy and a lot of us are driven by empirical numbers. But at the end of the day, it's also about saying that the anecdotal is important. In a film that I made for the University of Chicago called Aayi Gayi, when I went to villages which were not yet electrified and had been in the dark for 60, 70 years, people were waiting for asli or real electricity and were very resistant to renewable energy such as solar powered lights and other kinds of paraphernalia, because for years their idea of deprivation had found a visual metaphor in poles and electric wires. And a lot of people would say, oh, we'll just set up things and they'll come around. But that's exactly the kind of top-down behavior which doesn't work. Something as simple as asli bijli and nakli bijli, real electricity and fake electricity, can be a wonderful way of teasing open and saying, how do I design the information campaign? How do I build consensus within the community? Why should I build consensus within the community? How do I make certain things like renewable energy, which those of us who have had electricity from the grid for years now take for granted, become acceptable to people who have plenty sun and yet have never seen a single bulb go on? So I think a lot of this privileges the fact that by listening and talking and by setting people up for an opportunity to share their agenda and their vocabulary becomes so important. So shared vocabulary is so critical. Only then can we have a safe space. So in co-creation, I cannot invite you to the table and say, all right, I'd like you to set the aperture for 4.0. That's not fair. But it's okay for you to come in and tell me that, I'd like to be filmed in a way where I look regal because that's how I want to be presented. So those are the ways in which, you come across disciplinary boundaries and talk to each other. For policymakers as well who are within the room, or business people who work with teams, at the end of the day, it's not the semantics that should defeat you, but if you can find a vocabulary of gestures, of signs, of simple rituals like waiting for everybody to talk before you take the forum as a leader, a lot of these things make a difference. And co-creation encourages you to list them, learn from them, and iteratively do them again. And so eventually it is about mutual empowerment and not necessarily about now we have achieved 10,000 views on this. It's a question of saying that how can I, being part of this process, grow? And how can I also contribute to a larger collective goal? And articulating those really is a very, very important design problem. Who is listening? Who is asking these questions? Where are these goals being noted? How are they being evaluated? What are our parameters for progress? All of these become very, very important hard stops on the journey. Then, of course, I do want to say that there is a shift that I feel would be important in your vocabulary, not just for your own self, but also if you're working with larger teams and want to explain to them what co-creation is. So you will not only speak about productivity, you will have to sort of say that creativity is the shift that you go to. And usually what happens is that, you know, we tend to sort of place productivity as higher and give it more optimum weightage. But when it comes to creativity, we don't. Whereas on the other hand, what co-creation says is that if you are creative, you're not going to tell me, can you make 40 boxes by the end of the day? You're going to tell me, can you make me one box which makes you happy and is unique? And what can I do to help you facilitate that? And we'll get to the 40 number later. So, that's the kind of difference. It also encourages you to not think linearly. Okay, so we are not really looking at a model where it is step by step, but you can leapfrog, you can be elliptical, you can go crazy, but you come back to the core ideas of whatever you define as your mutual empowerment goals. Rather than holding on to security, like this is predictable, therefore I will do it, you embrace complexity, which could mean somebody coming in and saying, that's great, but I found a different phone for you to use, or that's great, but this product has been banned by the government, or you can do this, but 40 people can no longer be available because they've fallen ill. So complexity, when it is welcomed as an element or a lens, becomes very important. And you no longer talk about goals, you talk about what value you want to generate. And why this is not just hocus pocus, and it's not just things which we are, putting forward in terms of feel good philosophy, is because there are definite values. Why did the women participate and become co-creators in the project? Because they found value in finally being able to critique the surroundings that they were part of. They found value in being able to take time out and reflect on their own journeys. And these were important within their family structures and their community structures as well. Because it was only then that a homemaker tosses a phone in the middle of a conversation at her husband and says, flip it and listen to me now. On weekends, I washed your clothes and you went around in the city. And I thought to myself, what if I worked? Would he give up his life? And that's not a simple question about a gender battle. It is a deeper question about who we think can be in the public in a city and can perform economic productive activities, and who we automatically relegate to the private, the invisible, and completely deny any forms of traditional economic growth too. And then, of course, we've had the Swedish parliament argue about whether homemakers should be given any money or wages. So this category of labor remains an important category to work with. But then what is the value proposition of people who are anyway doing free, unpaid labor, also doing creative labor to co-create with me? It is perhaps this idea of self-esteem. It is perhaps this idea of performing mobility and not just, having theoretical mobility. So these are fabulous values. And what is the outcome? I have a concrete app, I have a concrete archive, and I'm able to, share the conversation with their consent with all of you and others as well. Then, of course, this idea that we like to be in charge as leaders. We are taught this whole idea of how we have this grand vision. And yes, there are men who have moved mountains and who have led movements. But if we really want to look at sustainability and we really want to solve the leadership problem, it has to be about decentralizing. So if you identify multiple stakeholders, if you have domestic workers, homemakers, volunteer photographers, volunteer cinematographers, or just people who want to contribute to a project like mine, I have to allow them to talk to each other. I have to allow them to find their own consensus and ways of working. I cannot be omnipresent. I should not aspire to be omnipresent. But by listening critically and empathetically, I can still be on top of the game. And that is so important to co-creation, because the process is not about I have done this and therefore I do that, but it is more about interactions. So you're actually trying to focus and see what interactions can I set up and how can I look at micro interactions and use those as feedback or as ways to move forward. And so instead of following a certain standard, you actually look at the speculative. You say what can be in the future. You try to imagine what lies ahead in ways that are creative, rather than saying only this is possible because of the past. So you kind of look at what is now and mold it in a way that it is more dynamic. and you allow space for people to say things which may not be achievable for you immediately, but might possibly transcend what you have thought of. So I would say that you need to decentralize for sure. You need to have interactions as a way of trying to set up consultations, and you have to be speculative. You have to embrace a little bit of the science fiction element, if at all, and see what things can be rather than what things should be. I believe that we had a moment of great synchronicity, and Rajesh also suggested that you guys look at this particular piece in the Harvard Business Review. I think it's very interesting and important because it is a school of thought which looks at co-creation in the space of enterprise and economics. I also particularly like it because the examples are so well laid out, which is, for example, a bank wanting to go online and making its services digital, and using junior tellers as the central expertise community, talking to them, even though they may not have financial knowledge, which is to the level of those who are in charge of the bank or our managers, etc. They are the ones who represent what the consumer might want because of parity of age, parity of finance, etc. And so what it is saying is that even for a bank which has huge investors and people who can read sheets and make estimations and direct growth, talking to somebody who was so lower down in the pecking order became the way for it to become more like an onion, peeling, concentric, rather than it being step up and a ladder with very little space for people, very little space for insights. And then, of course, this idea that we can get user feedback and use it to sort of change and co-think and co-design is not new today. When this piece was written, 10 years ago, a decade ago, things like Instagram entrepreneurs or platforms like Twitter, where you could actually get feedback, hold contests, and sort of grow with your consumer, were not possible. But today they are very achievable. And even films, those made by Ridley Scott and Richie Mehta, award-winning filmmakers, have used elements where there are contributions from everyday users of mobile phones as well. So I'm really saying big ticket Hollywood and just, your everyday chai wala, pan wala, filming something and sending it. And that becoming part of a global tapestry of what is film and what is film about today and what does it mean for us. So a lot of examples that I see around myself can easily be applied to you if you work in an organization, whether it is small, whether it is big, whether it is new, whether it is old, which is to say that this time when I make decisions and want to build on things, I will invite people not to the table, but possibly for a walk in the park. And if that's not possible because of the pandemic, then on a call that suits them, which could be a video call or an audio call, or just set up a poster contest and just get people to express how they perceive things. And then to say how you can use them as opposed to how you can eliminate them. And I think that change is very important. As a director, I can be so particular about the beauty of my frames, the quality of my image, the levels of the recording. But somewhere the texture of a mobile phone that shakes and a domestic worker who films everybody headless for several hours makes for a new way of looking at the world. And it can be interesting beyond incidental humor. It can be interesting about where their hands are, where their bodies are, how women can hold the phone and move in public spaces. So much to extrapolate, so much to learn from, and so many interesting ways in which that image could be extended with imagination, giving people heads, creating new universes above it. It's just a question of how we are seeing it within the frame or beyond the frame. So I think that at the end of the day, when you look at co-creation, the most important thing that I have learned is that you have to be like a mendicant, where when you knock on somebody's door and ask for alms, you may be feeling very hot, but you might get hot soup, and you may be very cold and you might get a scoop of ice cream. The point is you have to be grateful for what you have got. And you also need to know when to let go, which is to say that you may have this perfect idea and the best way to go about doing things. But if you're listening to people, at what point in the negotiation do you say, all right, I concede? And you don't concede because you have defeated, but you concede because the questions that they have asked have made you really rethink your plans because you have listened carefully. And just to show you how those questions were posed to me in my process, I'd like to sort of share one small clip before we move to the breakout rooms. So please allow me a moment to just pull up that clip.
अच्छा लगा आपको? बहुत अच्छा लगा। शाबाश। थैंक यू। आपके फोन से मैं बहुत कुछ सीख गई हूँ। आपको और अच्छी बात है। कैसा लग रहा है सीख के? बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है मुझे। सबसे बातें करती हूँ, मौसी से भी बातें करती हूँ। आज मैंने पेड़ की फोटो खींची, फूलों वाली, बहुत अच्छा पेड़ था वो, बहुत अच्छा लग रहा था, इसलिए मैं उसकी फोटो खींच के लाई। बहुत अच्छी। आज सारा मतलब अब की बार आओगे तो फिर और आपको दिखाऊंगी। बहुत अच्छा। Incorporate all this in your documentary. All this giving so much stuff. I need us. That's why मैं सबको दिखा रही हूँ। तो बस ये दिख रहा है। अच्छा। मैं इसे काफी सारे कार्य कर और तो करके मैं कुछ और मैं सबको दिखाती हूँ।
So actually, when I had started the project, I was, like I said, very aware of hierarchies. So you can see that in this one scene, you can understand so much. There's Meenakshi, who's sitting on the couch. She is in chemotherapy, and therefore, she is the way she is physically. Sitting right at her feet is Sangeeta, and my decision that the laptop, even though I'm not physically present, but I'm virtually co-present, should be at Sangeeta's level, stems from my desire to change a little bit of the spatial hierarchy. And even when I would be physically present in their home, Sangeeta would, to make me comfortable, sit on the couch with them, whereas she has been socially sort of coded into being more comfortable sitting at their feet, sitting on the floor. And it's so interesting because just this spatial arrangement made a lot of difference to how they interacted with me and how even the homemakers perceived the domestic workers. So there's this sense of how space and where you sit and how you sort of interact with each other makes a lot of difference. So choosing how to communicate, where to communicate is critical. Secondly, for me, I think the questions that Meenakshi was asking, which is, we have so much footage, how are you going to edit it? Where is this going to go? These are not questions that came from a trained filmmaker. This was just a person who was making the material and had so many questions that later became questions for my practice as well. I have so much material, but domestic workers and homemakers have time poverty. Will they ever be able to interact with the kind of material that we filmed over 2 years? Where will this 1 TB of data go? What is the pointy edge of what I'm trying to do? What is the MVP, the minimum viable product? Something which I didn't know existed in my vocabulary that came about only because the developers and programmers and UI UX volunteers at Code for Boston taught me this. So really, the questions that Meenakshi asks in New Delhi get answered for me in Boston. And this is possible because everybody is trying to think together and really not discard any questions that come our way. And today, the shape of the app, which is a very small app, which is a very short experience, is cognizant of the fact that homemakers and domestic workers have time poverty, and they don't have time to look at feature-length films. They don't have access to technologies that can allow them to do that. Yet the archive is so important, and protecting the archive so that nobody can harass them. There is no online trolling, and keeping it accessible but not publicly available are decisions that I made stemming from these interactions. And finally, the fact that Sangeeta says that today I filmed a tree that is beautiful and has flowers is a lovely moment, because when we talk about so-called empowerment projects, we want everybody to be saying, oh, I broke the mold. But this is also breaking the mold through pleasure, through enjoyment. And this really recasts the urban subject, especially the female urban subject, not as a woman who's afraid that somebody is going to attack her, or as a woman whose body is surveilled, but as a woman who is looking back, who's finding pleasure in the city, and has a moment where she can record it and keep it. And no mainstream media, no screechy politician can take that away from her. But I'm hoping somewhere a policymaker, a filmmaker, an educator, a thinker, an entrepreneur are listening carefully and saying, wow, this is a moment she enjoyed. And there are moments of pleasure and contemplation also that can become the fabric of how we talk about a city, or cure a city, or survive and revive in a city. And so I think now it's time for me to hand over to Rajesh.
Thank you, Anna. What a wonderful presentation, and for those clips. So, everybody knows the rules now. We'll have a breakout session with 4 groups. So, Anandana, could you just talk us through the 4 questions?
Yes. Okay. So I think the reason I also showed the preceding clip was kind of to scaffold these 4 breakout rooms. So what I wanted each of you to do is to look at your own contexts and talk about a space which you think could allow co-creation. So I'll give you another example. When I teach, much to everybody's consternation who is very formal, I sometimes sit on the table. Or I invite the students to talk about film in a park. What are these spatial changes that you can undertake? Maybe it is something you can't do immediately, but what can you do with the people you work with? So I'd love to hear about the domain that you work in, or the communities that you work with, and how you can bring spatial invigoration. The second is emotional, which is that what are the things that you really want to say or want to have said in the previous confabulation that you had. So the last time you had a team huddle, what is it that you could not say? And what is it that you would want to say, and why? And I think that's important, because it's very easy to say you should listen. It's very easy to say you should incorporate, but you should also be able to communicate. So what is it that you would communicate without censoring? Then the platform, which is to say that what medium would you use to collate all these experiences? Would it be virtual? Would it take into account different kinds of levels of literacy? Would it require money? Would it require more effort? Or is it just pen and paper? I live thanks to napkins, paper napkins. I find even Post-its sometimes are scary to people. So scribbling something on a napkin sheet and passing it around is easier. I find drawing easier to break literacy barriers. What medium, what platform would you use? And diversity, which is that who is the one person you don't want in the room, because you know in your heart of hearts they will say something which will destabilize this conversation that you have. And especially when it comes to communities, I know very well. So my instinctive reaction when I set up the project was no husbands, right? Because I didn't want them telling the women how to talk and how to use the phone. But slowly what happened was families became the acceptable presence in the project, because children started charging the batteries for the mothers. They started, talking about data storage and other things. So who is it that you don't want in the room, but is part of the picture? And how would you then involve them? And eventually it became, for me, a talk back between mothers and children and fathers. And so we saw everybody from appreciative to oppositional, and that also was a negotiation. So who would you involve? So diversity for me is not a checklist item. It's actually trying to say, who do I want out actually in a room, in a usual setting, who I would then invite in. So again, please talk about that. This could be an archetype. It could be a community member. It could be just an individual. So yeah, it would be great to sort of come back and see how we can collectively maybe pick ideas, and maybe you'll give me something for my next project as well.
Wonderful. So I have pasted the Google Doc as usual into the chat window. So we'll have our breakout rooms half an hour, and then we'll be back and quick reports from all the rooms and Ananda's comments on that, and then we'll be done.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So can we start the breakout rooms, please?